You know, when we think about how history is made, we almost always picture these massive sweeping events, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like treaties being signed or
Yeah, treaties in these gilded rooms, or generals moving entire armies across sprawling maps, or, I don't know, emperors issuing grand decrees from a throne.
right, the big cinematic moments.
Exactly. But what if the actual hinge of history isn't a royal decree at all? What if it's the quiet, entirely hidden life of a single helpless child?
Okay, let's untack this because the premise we are looking at today is staggering.
It really is.
The idea that history turns not on the actions of empires, but on what happens in a nursery.
It completely flips our usual understanding of power. And,
Yeah.
it validates that deep desire so many of us have to understand the why behind these ancient texts. The sermon we are diving into doesn't just treat the book of Exodus as some dusty story of ancient survival.
Right?
It frames it as redemptive history. It is essentially a masterclass in how deliverance is built entirely in the shadows of tyranny. And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
So, welcome in. Today, we're exploring a deeply compelling sermon unpacking the opening chapters of Exodus.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how a story about ancient oppression, a desperate mother, and a baby in a river basket offers a profound framework for understanding how hope actually operates when things seem utterly out of control for you.
Which is such a relevant concept.
Totally. But to really grasp the scale of that hope, we have to start by looking at the sheer scale of the threat. Because the sermon sets the stage by contrasting the end of Genesis with the beginning of Exodus, and the geopolitical landscape has just completely inverted.
It's a dramatic, honestly terrifying shift. Because at the end of Genesis, the Israelites are actually doing quite well.
Yeah, they were thriving.
Exactly. They're peaceful, they're secure in Egypt, largely because Joseph, who was, one of their own, had risen to immense political power and saved the entire region from famine. So they were seen as a massive asset. But you turn the page to Exodus chapter 1, and a new Pharaoh has risen to power. And the sermon points out a crucial, chilling detail here. This Pharaoh doesn't remember Joseph.
Or he just chooses not to, right?
Precisely. He chooses not to care about that history.
Right. He looks at this multiplying demographic of Israelites, and he doesn't see a blessing to his nation's economy anymore. He sees a severe national security threat.
Yeah.
Which feels like such a chilling, real-world phenomenon. We see this throughout human history, how terrifyingly fast the political winds can shift.
Oh, definitely.
One generation, you're a celebrated minority contributing to the empire, and the next, you are violently rebranded as an enemy of the state.
Paranoia just completely sets in. Pharaoh fears that if the Israelites keep growing, they might ally with Egypt's enemies during a war and rise up from within.
The classic fifth column fear.
Exactly, the fifth column. And his response to this paranoia is systematic. The sermon highlights this calculated escalation of cruelty. First, he enslaves them. He tries to break their spirit with just brutal, hard labor.
But that doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. When that doesn't stop their population growth,
Mhm.
he increases their burdens. And when they still multiply, he moves to covert genocide. He actually orders the Hebrew midwives to quietly kill the newborn boys as they're being delivered.
But those midwives refuse to comply, which is amazing. They fear God more than they fear the state. And because that covert plan fails, Pharaoh he takes the mask off completely.
Yeah, he does.
Exodus 1.22 describes this brutal public decree where he commands that every newborn Hebrew son must be cast into the Nile River.
And think about the psychological terror of that specific decree. The Nile was the absolute lifeblood of Egypt.
Right, it was everything to them.
It sustained their agriculture, their economy, their very existence in the desert. And Pharaoh turns that life-giving water source into an open graveyard, an instrument of state-sponsored death.
Wow. And beyond just the physical horror of it, the sermon highlights a massive theological tension happening behind the scenes, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because Pharaoh thinks he's just executing a ruthless political strategy to secure his borders. But what he is actually doing is declaring war on God's covenant promise. Back in Genesis 12, God promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation and bless the whole earth. By throwing the infant boys into the river, Pharaoh is actively trying to sever that promised bloodline.
He is fighting against the very architecture of God's redemptive plan.
But hold on, if a power structure has that kind of absolute control, if the state commands the military, writes the laws, and literally legalizes genocide by weaponizing the river itself, how does a marginalized people even begin to fight back?
That is the pivotal question. And if we connect this to the bigger picture the sermon paints, The resistance doesn't begin with a militia. It doesn't start with a political uprising or some grassroots rebellion.
No.
No, it begins in a nursery with an astonishing act of desperate faith by a completely ordinary family.
Let's talk about that nursery. Because a Levite couple has a baby boy, and the sermon zeroes in on the specific language used to describe this child. The Hebrew word used is toph,
Tough, yeah.
which generally means good, beautiful, or pleasing. But the sermon also pulls in a fascinating reference from Acts 7.10 in the New Testament, which clarifies that Moses was beautiful in God's sight.
And that phrasing completely changes the context. It tells us that God had set his favor on this child. It wasn't just, a mother thinking her baby was cute.
Right, every mom thinks their baby is cute.
Exactly. There was a divine weight to his existence. So the mother looks at her son and she hides him for 3 months. Now stop and imagine the suffocating, paralyzing fear of those 3 months.
I can't even imagine.
Every single time that baby cries, it could be a death sentence for the whole family. Every neighbor is a potential informant looking for a reward. Every soldier walking down the street is a lethal threat. Yet she hides him. And the sermon brings in Hebrews 11.23, which explicitly categorizes this hiding as an act of profound faith.
Which is such an important distinction because we so often confuse faith with, like, a feeling of absolute peace.
Yes.
The sermon argues that faith in this context is certainly not the absence of fear. You cannot be in that situation and not be terrified out of your mind.
Jill, you'd be petrified.
Faith here is trusting God when the situation looks mathematically impossible. But eventually, a growing baby gets too loud. She can't hide him anymore, so she takes a basket, waterproofs it with tar and pitch, puts her son inside, and places it in the reeds of the Nile.
And this is where the original language of the text gives us a massive clue about the mechanics of what is actually happening. The Hebrew word used for that basket is teva.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that this specific word is only used one other time in the entire Old Testament.
I know this one, and it honestly blew my mind when I first learned it. It's used for Noah's Ark.
Exactly. Noah's Ark is a teva. In both of these narratives, you have a world completely swallowed by death and judgment. You have the floodwaters in Noah's time and the weaponized Nile in Moses' time.
Wow.
And in both instances, God preserves the hope of humanity, the life of his people, through a sealed vessel floating in the waters of death.
Okay, the theological parallel is beautiful, but I have to push back here on the practical reality of what this mother is doing.
Sure.
Because I was thinking about this, and it's basically like putting your infant in a stroller, pushing that stroller out into moving highway traffic, and just desperately hoping a benevolent driver happens to swerve and stop to take them in.
Yeah, it's extreme.
The Nile is full of crocodiles. It's actively patrolled by soldiers, tasked with drowning these exact babies. So is this mother's action just blind, agonizing desperation? Or does the sermon suggest she had a strategic trust in a larger plan?
It is an agonizing choice, without a doubt, but the sermon heavily leans into the strategic trust aspect. By placing him in the teva, in the ark, she isn't just abandoning him to the elements, she is intentionally transferring him from her own powerless hands into God's sovereign hands.
Oh, that's powerful.
She has exhausted her physical means to protect him, so she yields him entirely to the providence of God. And that surrender sets the stage for one of the most stunning subversive twists in all of recorded history.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the person who comes down to the river to bathe is none other than Pharaoh's own daughter, the daughter of the architect of the genocide.
Of all people.
She sees the basket, opens it, and the baby is crying. And against all the laws of her father, she has compassion on him.
It is an act of quiet rebellion happening right under Pharaoh's nose, inside his own household.
And it gets even better. Moses' older sister Miriam has been tracking the basket, watching from the reeds. She boldly steps out, which, by the way, a Hebrew slave girl approaching Egyptian royalty is incredibly dangerous in itself.
Oh, massively risky.
And she says, "Hey, do you want me to go find a Hebrew woman to nurse this baby for you?" The princess agrees, and Miriam brings back Moses' own mother. The sheer comedy of this is unbelievable. Pharaoh's daughter literally pays Moses' mother a state wage to safely nurse and raise her own son.
It's a flawless reversal of power. Pharaoh intended to completely wipe out the Hebrews, and instead, his own royal treasury ends up financing the upbringing, the elite education, and the protection of the very man who will eventually dismantle his empire.
The oppressor funding the revolution.
Exactly.
But looking at how perfectly these pieces fall into place naturally raises a big philosophical question for the listener. The sermon quotes the theologian R.C. Sproul, who said, "If there is one maverick molecule in all the universe, then God is not sovereign."
Such a great quote.
The sermon is arguing that every single detail, the exact time the princess took a bath, the baby crying at the perfect second to elicit sympathy, Miriam's courage, is under absolute divine control. But doesn't that kind of absolute sovereignty negate human choice? Does it turn these people into robots?
That is the beautiful tension this sermon explores. It argues that God's sovereignty doesn't negate human choice at all. It actually works entirely through it.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about the mechanics of the story. The mother's desperation to save her child was real. The Egyptian princess's genuine rush of compassion was a real human emotion. The sister's quick thinking was her own intellect at work.
Right.
But the point being made is that God's architectural design is so grand and so comprehensive, he weaves all those free, seemingly disconnected human choices together to construct an unbreakable chain of deliverance. He doesn't override their wills, he incorporates them into a masterpiece of timing.
And the sermon is very deliberate in insisting that this chain of deliverance isn't just some literary masterpiece, right? It is a historical reality.
Yes.
Which is a crucial distinction because, let's face it, it is incredibly easy for modern readers to look at the story of a baby in a basket floating down a river and treat it like a superhero origin myth. Like Superman being put in a rocket escaping Krypton.
Yeah, and the sermon addresses those modern scholars who dismiss Moses as a mere myth head-on. It points to tangible archaeological evidence to ground the narrative. Specifically, it highlights excavations at ancient Everest located in the Nile Delta.
What did they find there?
Archaeologists found a massive Asiatic Semitic population living in Egypt during the New Kingdom period. The layout of the settlements, the cultural artifacts, and even the sudden abandonment of the area perfectly mirror the setting in the Exodus described in the biblical text.
Add to that the overwhelming scriptural affirmation. The law, the prophets, the Psalms all treat Moses as a historical bedrock. The sermon notes that Psalm 90, for example, was actually written by Moses himself.
Wow, yeah.
And crucially, it anchors this in the words of Jesus. In John 5:46, Jesus tells the religious leaders, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me."
And that raises an unavoidable point of logic that the sermon addresses directly. If a listener trusts the authority of Christ, they cannot logically dismiss Moses as a legend. Christ stakes his own credibility on the historical reality of Moses.
That's a heavy point.
It is. But I'll turn this back to you. Why do you think it is so vital for the listener to view this as real time, real places, real people? Why can't it just be a helpful, inspiring moral fable about good conquering evil?
Because if it's just a fable, it only offers a sentiment. It's just a nice idea that makes us feel warm inside. But if it's real history, it offers us a guarantee. It means the pattern of evil we see in the world and the pattern of God's rescue are actual forces at work in reality.
Right.
The sermon argues that Pharaoh's decree wasn't just isolated ancient politics. It was part of a massive, ongoing spiritual conflict. It traces us all the way back to Genesis 3:15, where God promised a seed, a descendant who would eventually crush Satan.
Yes, the promised seed.
Ever since that promise, the enemy's playbook has been to constantly try to destroy that promised bloodline. Because if the bloodline ends, the promise of a savior fails.
That is exactly the mechanism at work here. We see that exact repeating pattern, that specific playbook of severing the bloodline used again and again throughout history.
Oh, absolutely.
The sermon lists the historical examples, like an earlier Pharaoh taking Sarah into his house in Genesis, trying to interrupt the line of Abraham. Haman trying to legally annihilate all the Jews in the book of Esther. And centuries later, King Herod ordering the slaughter of the infants in Bethlehem, trying to kill Jesus.
It's the same tactic every time. Wipe out the children, sever the line, stop the rescue.
But the rescue is also patterned. Look at the very name Moses. The Egyptian princess names him Moses, which in Hebrew emphasizes the phrase drawn out, because she drew him out of the water.
Right.
The sermon points out how perfectly this foreshadows his entire life's mission. He was drawn out of the water of death, and he will eventually draw the entire nation of Israel out of Egypt through the waters of the Red Sea.
The sermon calls him a type of Christ, which is a really fascinating theological concept. For those unfamiliar, typology is essentially when an Old Testament historical reality acts as a shadow, pointing to a much larger, more permanent New Testament reality.
Yes, a foreshadowing.
So, Moses delivered his people from physical slavery in Egypt. Jesus delivers his people from the spiritual slavery of sin. Moses mediated the old covenant at Mount Sinai. Jesus mediates the new covenant through his own blood. Moses leads them through the Red Sea. Jesus leads his people through death into eternal life.
It's a profound escalation. Moses was a great deliverer, but the sermon is adamant that Jesus is the greater Savior. Moses could only get them out of Egypt, but he couldn't change their hearts.
That's a huge difference.
And that transition from the historical events in the Nile to the ultimate spiritual reality of Christ is exactly where the sermon shifts its focus to the listener's daily life.
So what does this all mean? We've covered the history, the archaeology, the massive redemptive arcs, but let's bring it down to eye level.
Let's do it.
Often when people talk about God's providence, they use that old cliche of looking at the messy back of a woven tapestry while God sees the beautiful picture on the front.
Sure, we've all heard that one.
But honestly, I think a better way to understand the mechanism the sermon is describing is to think about the background code of a complex app on your phone.
Oh, I like that.
You look at the screen and you just see a clean interface. Maybe you press a button to order food or send a message. It seems simple. But beneath that screen, there are millions of lines of code running silently, API calls firing off to servers across the world, databases updating in milliseconds. You can't see any of the code, but it is the invisible architecture making the entire experience possible.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize what theologians call hidden providence.
Right. So how does the listener apply this hidden providence when they are just staring at a blank screen in their own life? When they look at the news or their bank account or a medical diagnosis, and it feels like the code is broken and evil is just objectively winning.
The sermon offers a deeply comforting application here. It points out a stunning, easily missed detail about Exodus chapter 2. God is never directly mentioned in the narrative.
Really? Not once.
Not once. Think about that. In a chapter entirely about God's rescue, his name isn't on the page. There are no miracles yet. There are no burning bushes, no plagues of locusts, no seas splitting in half.
Just a mother, a sister, a princess, and a crying baby.
Exactly. Just ordinary people doing ordinary things. But the sermon emphasizes that God often prefers to work precisely through these ordinary circumstances, and particularly through ordinary people with absolutely no political power.
Yeah.
It references 1 Corinthians 1.27, the idea that God deliberately chooses what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God didn't use an opposing, heavily armed military to defeat Pharaoh's genocide. He used a desperate mother, a clever sister, and the oppressor's own daughter.
It completely strips all the glory away from human institutions.
It really does.
The sermon references the Westminster Confession here, which, for context, is a highly influential 17th century foundational document of theology. It notes that God, in his ordinary providence, uses means. He works through the daily, mundane, seemingly insignificant choices of people. Even when we can't see the burning bush or the parted sea, the silent code of his providence is still running perfectly in the background.
And this leads to the most crucial theological anchor of the entire sermon. Salvation belongs to God. The sermon anchors this idea in the book of Jonah to make the point. Think about the Israelites in Egypt. They didn't organize a grassroots rebellion.
No.
They didn't elect a new leader. They didn't produce their own deliverer through sheer willpower or strategic brilliance. God initiated the rescue entirely on his own while they were completely helpless.
Which is such a countercultural message today. We are so heavily conditioned to believe that if we want to be saved, whether from a toxic situation, a cultural decline, or our own internal struggles, we have to bootstrap our way out of it.
Oh, absolutely. The self-help culture.
Exactly. We are told we have to be the heroes of our own story. But the sermon insists that salvation never begins with human effort.
Never. And that is exactly how the sermon brings its audience to the Lord's table, to communion. It connects the physical bread and the cup to this greater exodus achieved by Christ. Just as Israel could not free themselves from Pharaoh's grip, we cannot free ourselves from the grip of sin and death. God had to initiate the rescue. He had to provide the deliverer.
And he did it in a way the world would never, ever expect. Both in Exodus with a helpless baby floating in a river, and in the Gospels with a battered Savior dying on a cross, what looked to the world like ultimate weakness and total defeat was actually the precise mechanism of absolute victory.
If we synthesize all of this, the primary takeaway the sermon leaves us with is this. When evil schemes to destroy, God is already quietly preparing a deliverer. Deliverance doesn't usually look like a parted sea right away. Most of the time, in the messy, terrifying middle of the story, it just looks like an ordinary, faithful action in the dark. A mother waterproofing a basket. A sister stepping out of the reeds. It's trusting that God is entirely in control of the silent code, even when the throne room of the world is occupied by a tyrant.
Which brings us right back to where we started, the hinge of history not being the grand decree, but the hidden things. And for you, the listener, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've talked about today.
Yeah.
Consider this incredibly profound irony. The ultimate deliverer of the nation of Israel walked around his entire life carrying an Egyptian name, Moses, a name given to him by the daughter of the very man trying to exterminate his people. God literally hid the salvation of an entire nation inside the household of the enemy.
It's amazing.
So if God can do that, if God can do that, what perfectly hidden solutions might he have already planted inside the biggest, most intimidating obstacles you are facing right now?
A powerful question to carry with you.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sermon. We'll see you next time.